All right, so here's Module 8. This is a fairly brief video lecture, but I just wanted to kind of touch on a couple of points here. So this module is about kind of technology, the dangers of technology, and the ways in which technological change or different types of technologies can potentially end humankind as we know it or create apocalypses. Um, all right, so just a few things I wanted to mention here. And, one of the interesting things about technology and apocalypse is that this is something that actually one of the students in this course brought up in terms of their project that they're doing for this class, which is this idea that technology can be the end of civilization as we know it, or dramatically change life sort of in two different ways. We can actually, in some respects, have an apocalypse from a lack of technology, if like all of our technologies all of a sudden break down, if all of a sudden we lose all the computer control systems, if we have something like, which we'll talk about next module, things like electromagnetic pulse and coronal mass ejections that essentially fry a lot of our technology. That can be one kind of apocalypse. But what we're going to kind of focus on in this module is the idea that our technologies can kind of get away from us and potentially kind of turn back on humanity and destroy it. Now, a piece of something, we've kind of looked at a little bit of this when we looked at nuclear hazards last module, in that, of course, nuclear weapons is a form of technology and one that which of course, makes it very possible for humans to then end all life on Earth. And this is a relatively new technology, of course, developed in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and which very much dramatically changes the ability of humans to kind of end humankind. Although it's not necessarily a self-aware technology, it's not a technology that can kind of operate without us, but it is, as we kind of saw, a technology that can be prone to accidental use or accidents in general. And of course, this idea that our technologies are something that can kind of get away from us and hurt us is a relatively old idea. If you look back at Frankenstein as a great example of this, this is, I believe, Young Frankenstein, which is sort of a satirical version of Frankenstein. But this idea that that humans' creations will come back to sort of haunt us and cause us damage rather than sort of serve humanity is a very old idea. But the question that kind of starts coming up, and you'll see this in the readings and the other short videos for this section, as well as, I guess, the longer video for that we'll see too, is this idea that are things an order of magnitude different when our technologies can think and act, as opposed to just tools that we can use. And that's where this idea of sort of Frankenstein kind of comes from. And particularly, one of the big concerns is, artificial intelligence. When we start creating computer systems or robotic systems that have the ability to sort of think for themselves, will they make decisions that might end up hurting us as a whole, us being humanity? And some of the videos get into this, and we'll talk about this more in the online discussion, but there's this idea of the singularity, which when you start having smart machines build other smart machines that build still more smart machines, do you end up with machines that are so intelligent that it vastly outstrips humans' ability to kind of comprehend what they're doing or how to control them, or even like what their intent might be? And then there's also this other question that comes up when we talk about technologies, which is a little different from AI, but just this idea that's sometimes referred to as cyborgs, which is the ability for kind of humans to mesh with technologies and create beings that are sort of part biological, part technological or mechanical. And of course, in science fiction, this is a fairly standard trope. And so you get this this term cyborg, a being with organic and biomechanical kind of parts. But there's also this idea that in some respects we are already cyborgs in a sense, and that who we are, how we go about through our daily lives, even if we don't have plugs stuck in our head, that we are still very much like who we act as people is very much mediated by our technologies. So for instance, if we think about kind of who we are and how we act in the world, would we be a lot different without our smartphones? Obviously, we would be. Smartphones are in some respects sort of a piece of technology that very much then becomes part of who we are and how we move through the world and how we expect to access information, how we expect to communicate, and all of these sort of things. And so some people argue that in a sense we're already cyborgs, even if it's not physically embedded into our bodily structure. And then one of the things that also comes up in some of the AI stuff around cyborgs is, could we become sort of cyborgs of a different sort? Like, for instance, could artificial intelligence systems, or even just different humans with that knowledge generated from different abilities to read genetic codes and to alter genetic codes, could we actually use technology to then shift what biological organisms look like? In other words, we may not necessarily insert metal into other organisms, but could we use our technology and potentially also AI to try and understand genetic codes of living things better, and then make alterations so that the living beings, even though they're purely biological, would be the product of not just their biology, but also of sort of intentional alteration that artificial intelligence has, sort of given us some ability to do and to manipulate. And so, while that may seem like kind of far out science fiction, this is something that, of course, stuff like genetic manipulation and cloning and making organisms that have genetic modification is certainly not science fiction. It's something that's very much happening today. And so the question is, those organisms that are produced, I mean, these questions are already out there. If a company or scientist designs a new kind of organism using genetic technologies, who owns that technology, or who owns that life form? And most of the time, courts have kind of decided that those new life forms, are actually owned and patented by the people that modify the genetics. And so there are things like, there's a certain kind of mouse used in medical technologies or medical experiments called oncomouse, which is like used for cancer diagnoses and that sort of thing, which has become basically owned property of the people that made it, even though it's a biological organism. And so these kinds of ideas of, as genetic technology continues to evolve, how the life forms that are created in a sense are cyborg, and that they are the result of technology and their biologies. Another thing that kind of comes up in some of the scarier aspects of artificial intelligence and their ability to do damage are things like nanobots. And there's a short video that you're going to watch about nanobots. But one of the concerns is that if you kind of make a nanobots are just very, very small robots, and some of them are designed to go inside of bodies and kind of do medical procedures. But there's this idea of, what if you actually program nanobots to sort of take what's out there in the world and create more of itself. In other words, a self-replicating nanobot that could, in theory, go around and kind of pull apart anything that it comes in contact with and tries to then remake it into something else. And there's some very interesting kind of stories along the lines of the idea that nanobots, you design a nanobot to make everything in the world into paper clips, and to make like two versions of itself and then paper clips. And so it goes out, makes two more of itself, and makes paper clips out of everything. And so it goes onto the desk and it grabs the stapler and it pulls it apart and turns it into paper clips, and it does something else and it comes into my body and tears it apart, tries to make it into paper clips, and it keeps replicating and making more of itself, and eventually the whole earth is swarmed and it's just full of these tiny organisms and paper clips. Those kinds of kind of far out disaster scenarios. But anyway, nanobots is another thing that comes up. And then one of the other short videos for this section is a very short interview with a robot that somebody designed, and with artificial intelligence, and it's answering the questions. And as you'll see, it has some pretty interesting and slightly scary things to say. It also looks really creepy because it's designed to look like Philip K. Dick, who's the writer that wrote Blade Runner, or actually wrote Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which then became the movie Blade Runner back in like the 80s. But anyway, the robot's pretty creepy looking, but you'll see. And then after that, we got a movie. And so in that movie, it's some of you may be familiar with this movie or have seen it before and others not, but just this idea of sort of the machines and the artificial intelligence and how it kind of turns on humanity and destroys them. Doesn't necessarily give anything away for the movie. But all right, that's it for this module. So make sure you watch the other short videos, do the reading, and the discussion questions for both for the movie and the reading on AI. All right, that's it.